The World Cup is the biggest sporting event on Earth. More than 5 billion people watched the last tournament alone. But the history behind football's greatest competition is even crazier than you might imagine. It's a story filled with wars, politics, controversy, miracles, heartbreak, and some of the greatest players to ever step onto a football pitch. From Pelé and Maradona to Zidane, Ronaldo, Messi, and Mbappé, this is the complete history of the FIFA World Cup. And believe me, the story starts long before the World Cup even existed. Nearly 100 years ago, there was no World Cup. In fact, international football was represented by the Olympic Games. Back in 1914, FIFA officially recognized the Olympic football tournament as the World Championship. For more than 20 years, winning Olympic gold meant becoming the champions of the world. But as football became increasingly popular across the globe, one man had a revolutionary idea. His name was Jules Rimet. The Frenchman believed that football deserved its own international tournament. Something bigger, something grander, something that would unite nations through the beautiful game. And on May 28, 1928, his vision became reality. FIFA voted to create its own competition. The FIFA World Cup had officially been born. Just 2 years later, Uruguay hosted the very first World Cup. At the time, Uruguay were considered the best team in the world after winning the Olympic tournaments. But organizing the competition wasn't easy. Europe was suffering from financial difficulties, and crossing the Atlantic by ship took weeks. As a result, many nations simply couldn't afford the journey. Only 13 teams participated. 7 came from South America, 4 from Europe, and 2 from North America. Egypt had been scheduled to become Africa's first representative, but bad weather delayed their ship and they missed the tournament entirely. Japan and Thailand also withdrew before the competition began. Despite all the difficulties, on July 13, 1930, history was made. The first World Cup kicked off. After weeks of competition, the final saw hosts Uruguay face their fierce rivals, Argentina. In front of 93,000 spectators, Uruguay defeated Argentina 4-2 and became the first champions in World Cup history. The dream of Jules Rimet.
4 years later, the tournament moved to Italy. This was intended to begin a tradition of alternating between Europe and South America. Interest had grown rapidly. For the first time, qualification matches were introduced. 16 nations earned a place in the finals. However, Uruguay refused to participate. Still angry over the low European attendance in 1930, the defending champions boycotted the tournament. Meanwhile, Egypt became the first African nation to ever appear at a World Cup. Unfortunately, their journey ended in the first round. The final featured Italy against Czechoslovakia. After extra time, Italy emerged victorious. Europe had its first World Cup champion. The 1938 World Cup was hosted by France, but controversy quickly surrounded the tournament. Many expected the World Cup to return to South America. Instead, Europe hosted again. Argentina and Uruguay protested by refusing to participate. Meanwhile, Europe itself was moving closer to war. Austria had been annexed by Germany, reducing the tournament to 15 teams. Despite the growing tension across the continent, Italy once again reached the final. They defeated Hungary 4-2 and became back-to-back world champions. Football's greatest tournament seemed unstoppable.
After 3 successful tournaments, fans eagerly awaited the next edition. But there was one problem. The world was at war. World War II brought international football to a halt. The tournaments planned for 1942 and 1946 were canceled. Players went to battle. Stadiums stood empty. And for 12 long years, the World Cup disappeared. But when it returned in spectacular fashion. 12 years later, the World Cup finally returned. And this time, the tournament headed back to South America. Brazil was chosen as the host nation, and excitement around the world reached unprecedented levels. But even before the competition began, controversy was already in the air. India withdrew after FIFA insisted players wear proper boots, ending their hopes of participating. Meanwhile, Italy entered the tournament under tragic circumstances. Just 1 year earlier, the devastating Superga air disaster had wiped out much of the famous Torino squad, which formed the backbone of the Italian national team. Another major development was the arrival of the British nations. For years, they had stayed outside FIFA due to political disagreements. Now, they were finally joining football's biggest stage. And what a tournament it was. In front of an unbelievable crowd of 173,000 spectators inside the Maracana Stadium, Uruguay stunned the host nation Brazil and claimed their second World Cup title. To this day, the match remains one of the most heartbreaking moments in Brazilian football history. 4 years later, Switzerland hosted the World Cup, and fans witnessed the highest-scoring tournament in history. But perhaps even more importantly, this was the first World Cup to be televised on a large scale. For the first time ever, millions of fans could watch from home. Football had officially become a global phenomenon. Hungary entered the tournament as overwhelming favorites. Led by Ferenc Puskás, they looked unstoppable. They scored an astonishing 27 goals and reached the final after demolishing nearly every opponent in their path. In the final, Hungary raced into a 2-goal lead after just 8 minutes. The trophy seemed inevitable. But West Germany had other ideas. Against all odds, the Germans fought back and completed one of the greatest upsets in football history. They won 3-2. The match became known as the Miracle of Bern. And German football would never be the same again.
By 1958, Sweden hosted the tournament, and the football world was about to meet a young boy who would change the sport forever. His name was Pelé. He was only 17 years old, but age didn't matter. Pelé lit up the competition with incredible performances. He scored in every knockout match, and in the final, he scored twice as Brazil defeated Sweden 5-2. Brazil had become world champions for the first time, and Pelé had announced himself to the world. Alongside him stood Mario Zagallo, a player who would later become one of the most successful figures in football history. But another record was set that year. French striker Just Fontaine scored 13 goals in a single tournament. More than 60 years later, no one has ever broken that record.
Chile hosted the next World Cup, and the fact that the tournament happened at all was remarkable. Just 2 years earlier, devastating earthquakes had struck the country. Much of the infrastructure had to be rebuilt. Yet somehow, Chile pulled it off. Brazil entered as defending champions. Pelé suffered injuries and was unable to dominate as he had 4 years earlier. Fortunately, Brazil had plenty of other stars. Players like Garrincha stepped up and carried the team to another title.
Brazil defeated Czechoslovakia in the final and became back-to-back world champions. But the tournament also became famous for another reason: violence. The infamous Battle of Santiago between Chile and Italy became one of the roughest matches ever played. Punches, kicks, red cards, and even police officers entering the field. Football had never seen anything quite like it.
England hosted the World Cup in 1966, and for the English fans, it remains one of the greatest summers in their history. Led by Bobby Charlton, Gordon Banks, and Geoff Hurst, England reached the final against West Germany. The match went to extra time. Then came one of the most controversial goals in football history. Did the ball cross the line? To this day, fans still argue. But the goal stood. England eventually won 4-2. Geoff Hurst scored a hat-trick, and England lifted their first and only World Cup trophy. Meanwhile, Portugal's Eusebio emerged as one of the stars of the tournament, finishing as top scorer. And North Korea shocked the world.
If 1958 introduced Pelé to the world, 1970 cemented his immortality. Mexico became the first North American nation to host the World Cup, and Brazil arrived with one of the greatest teams football has ever seen. Pelé, Jairzinho, Rivellino, Carlos Alberto, and under the management of Zagallo, they played football that seemed almost artistic. Brazil swept aside Italy 4-1 in the final, winning their third World Cup. Pelé became the first player in history to win 3 World Cups. Many historians still consider the Brazilian team of 1970 to be the greatest side ever assembled. But while Brazil
By 1974, the World Cup returned to West Germany, and football itself was changing. Gone were the days of rigid positions and predictable tactics. A revolutionary style known as total football had emerged from the Netherlands. Led by the brilliant Johan Cruyff, the Dutch played a brand of football unlike anything the world had ever seen. Defenders became attackers. Midfielders became defenders. Every player seemed capable of doing everything. The Netherlands captured the imagination of millions. But in the final, they faced the hosts, West Germany. Even before Germany touched the...
4 years later, the world turned its eyes to Argentina. But this tournament wasn't just a celebration of sport. It unfolded under the suffocating shadow of military rule. From the very beginning, the event was shrouded in political controversy. Yet inside the stadium, a different story was being written. A nation was chasing a dream, to be crowned world champions for the very first time. Led by the unstoppable Mario Kempes, and fueled by the roar of a desperate, passionate home crowd, Argentina fought their way to the final. Their opponent, the formidable Netherlands. After a grueling battle that stretched into extra time, the result was sealed. 3-1. The celebrations that night were legendary, unforgettable. Mario Kempes became more than a player. He was a national icon. But as the confetti settled, the ghosts of that tournament would linger. 1982, the World Cup arrives in Spain, and this time it's bigger than ever. The tournament expands to 24 teams, and the energy is contagious. Football is no longer just a sport, it's a global obsession. New nations, new fans, and a brand new stage for legends to be born. But all eyes, they were on one team, Brazil.
With a lineup of pure magic, Zico, Socrates, Falcao, and Eder, they played football like a work of art. They were the golden team everyone expected to rule the world. But then, the stage was set for one of the greatest upsets in history. Italy versus Brazil, the second group stage. And just when we thought we knew the script, one man stepped into the spotlight: Paolo Rossi. In a performance for the ages, Rossi delivered a stunning hat trick. Italy clinches it 3-2. In a heartbeat, the Brazilian dream was over, and the world was left in shock. Italy soared from there.
1986, Mexico makes history, becoming the first nation to host the World Cup twice. But one man didn't just play in this tournament, he owned it: Diego Armando Maradona. From the opening whistle to the final trophy lift, he produced a series of performances that remain to this day the greatest individual display in the history of the sport. But there was one match that changed everything: the quarterfinal against England. The air was thick with tension, echoing the wounds of the Falklands War. And then, the moment that stopped the world. Maradona rose above the goalkeeper, and with a flick of his hand, he punched the ball into the net. The referee missed it. The goal stood. In his own words, it was a little with the head of Maradona and a little with the hand of God. But what happened just 4 minutes later? That was no accident. That was genius. Picking up the ball in his own half, he danced past 5 English defenders, one after another. He dismantled them. He scored what the world would forever call the goal of the century. Argentina would go on to defeat West Germany in the final, and as Maradona hoisted that trophy to the sky, he wasn't just a player anymore. He was immortal.
1990, the World Cup returns to Italy. While this tournament was often defined by its tactical battles and a drought of goals, it delivered moments of pure, unfiltered emotion that still resonate today. It was a rematch of the ages: West Germany against Argentina in the final. But this time, the script was flipped. A late, decisive penalty secured a 1-0 victory for the Germans. And with that win, the legendary Franz Beckenbauer achieved the impossible, becoming only the second person in history to conquer the world as both a player and a manager. But if there was one heartbeat to this tournament, it wasn't in the final. It was the story of Cameroon. Led by the iconic 38-year-old Roger Milla, the indomitable Lions shattered ceilings, becoming the first African nation to reach the quarterfinals. And who could forget the celebrations? Every time Milla found the net, he danced by the corner flag, a joy that turned him into the global face of Italia 90. Meanwhile, the world around the pitch was being reshaped. The Berlin Wall had fallen. Germany was reuniting. And as the world changed, football itself was crossing the threshold into a bold new age.
1994, FIFA makes a bold, controversial move, taking the World Cup to the United States. To many, it seemed like a strange gamble. In a land where soccer was far from the main stage, how would it work? But FIFA had a vision. They were here to conquer a new market. And the gamble? It paid off in a massive way. Over 3.5 million fans poured into the stadiums, shattering records and making it the most attended World Cup in history. On the pitch, the Titans clashed: Brazil versus Italy. For the very first time, the greatest prize in football would be decided from the penalty spot. The tension was suffocating. And then, the heartbreak. Roberto Baggio, a genius of his generation, sent his decisive penalty sailing over the bar. Brazil crowned themselves champions for the 4th time. But behind the confetti and the cheers, 1994 carried a darker, haunting shadow. The tragic murder of Colombian defender Andrés Escobar shortly after he returned home sent shockwaves through the world. It was a brutal, heartbreaking reminder that sometimes, on football's greatest stage, the consequences can be far, far heavier than a trophy.
1998, France hosts the world. For the first time, the tournament expands to 32 nations. The World Cup has finally shed its skin, evolving into a truly global spectacle. But as the world watched, all eyes were locked on one man, the Brazilian superstar, Ronaldo, the phenomenon. However, just hours before the biggest night of his life, tragedy struck. A mysterious medical incident, a convulsion that left the world in shock and the Brazil team in disarray. Despite the chaos, Ronaldo took the field, but he was a ghost of the player we knew. He was clearly not himself. France took full advantage of the opening. Led by a midfield maestro playing at the absolute peak of his powers, Zinedine Zidane, the hosts dismantled the champions. 2 iconic headers from Zizou put the result beyond doubt, and a late third goal sealed a historic 3-0 victory. France were world champions for the very first time, and in that moment, a new generation of stars had officially arrived. By the turn of the century, the World Cup had completed its transformation. From a modest 14-team competition into the most watched sporting event on Earth. But if we thought the 20th century gave us drama, the 21st century was just getting started. It would bring even more heartbreak, more shocking upsets, more history, and 2 names that would go on to define an entire generation of football: Lionel Messi and Cristiano Ronaldo.
2002, a new frontier. For the first time in history, the World Cup arrives in Asia, co-hosted by South Korea and Japan. And from the very first whistle, the status quo was shattered. Defending champions France, eliminated without a single goal. Argentina, a shocking early exit. The giants were falling, and the stage was set for the impossible. And no one made the impossible look more real than South Korea. Backed by a wall of deafening home support, they defied the odds, toppling European powerhouses like Italy and Spain to reach the semi-finals, a feat no Asian nation had ever achieved before. But while the hosts were writing history, one man was writing his own. Brazil was on a silent, clinical march toward glory, led by the most lethal trio the world had ever seen: Ronaldo, Rivaldo, and Ronaldinho. But this tournament belonged above all else to Ronaldo. Just 4 years earlier, he was the face of heartbreak in France. Devastating knee injuries had left the world wondering if the phenomenon would ever play again. Many said his career was over. They were wrong. In the final against Germany, Ronaldo stood tall, scoring twice to seal a 2-0 victory. With 8 goals in the tournament, he didn't just win a trophy, he completed perhaps the greatest comeback in the history of sports. Brazil stood at the summit, 5-time world champions, a record that remains untouchable to this day.
2006, Germany hosts the world. And as the tournament reaches its peak, the stage is set for a finale that no one could have ever predicted: Italy versus France. But throughout the competition, one narrative stood taller than all others: Zinedine Zidane. Playing the final matches of a legendary career, Zidane was on a mission. He didn't just lead France, he willed them to the final. And when the pressure was at its absolute highest, he opened the scoring with an audacious, ice-cold Panenka penalty. The stage was set for a fairy tale ending. But then, football witnessed something that defied all logic, something that stopped the world in its tracks. Deep into extra time, the tension boiled over. Zidane, the captain, the icon, turned and headbutted Italian defender Marco Materazzi in the chest. A stunned silence fell over the stadium. The referee reached into his pocket, and the French captain was sent off. Just like that, his legendary career ended with a red card. The match drifted into the cold, clinical reality of penalties. Italy prevailed, claiming their 4th World Cup title. And yet, amidst the celebrations in Rome, the image that remains burned into our memories is not the trophy lift. It is the sight of Zinedine Zidane walking past the gold, disappearing into the tunnel.
leaving the pitch and his career behind him in the most haunting exit in sporting history.
2010. The World Cup touches African soil for the very first time. South Africa steps into the spotlight, and the world is changed forever. The atmosphere? Electric. The sound? The constant, roaring drone of the vuvuzela echoing from every corner of every stadium. For an entire month, the heartbeat of the globe wasn't just in the game, it was in the pulse of the continent. On the pitch, a new superpower was rising: Spain. Armed with a generation of pure technical wizards, Xavi, Iniesta, David Villa, they didn't just play football, they dismantled the opposition with a relentless, hypnotic style of possession. Patient, precise, unstoppable. They marched to the final against the Netherlands, and just as the shadows grew long and the penalty shootout loomed, Andres Iniesta struck. A moment of magic in extra time. Spain were champions of the world for the very first time. But the story of South Africa will always hold a bittersweet sting. Ghana, the pride of the continent, stood just inches away from becoming the first African nation to reach a semi-final. Then, a moment of madness. Uruguay's Luis Suarez, in a desperate act of defiance, deliberately handled the ball on the goal line. A red card, a penalty, a chance for history. But the ball refused to find the net. Ghana's dream was crushed in a heartbeat. One kick away from glory, and a continent was left to wonder what could have been.
2014. The World Cup returns to the spiritual home of football, Brazil. The entire nation was gripped by a single desperate dream: redemption. They were ready to erase the ghosts of 1950, and everything was building toward a perfect fairy tale ending. But then, Germany happened. In a semi-final that the world watched in absolute paralyzed disbelief, the dream didn't just end, it shattered. One goal, then two, then 3, 4, 5. In the span of just 29 minutes, the home of football was brought to its knees, trailing 5-0. By the time the final whistle blew on that historic night, the scoreboard read a haunting 7-1. It remains, without question, the most shocking result in the history of the sport. Germany marched on to the final, where Mario Götze's beautiful, clinical extra-time strike secured their 4th World Cup title. But while the Germans celebrated their crowning glory, Brazil was left in a different world. A world where the silence in the stadiums was louder than the cheers. For the nation that lives for football, the scars of that night still remain.
Russia hosted the World Cup in 2018, and a new superstar announced himself to the world: Kylian Mbappé. At just 19 years old, the French forward electrified the tournament with his speed and skill. France reached the final against Croatia, one of the greatest underdog stories in World Cup history. Despite Croatia's incredible journey, France proved too strong. They won 4-2, and Mbappé became only the second teenager after Pelé to score in a World Cup final. A new era had begun, but one question remained. Would Lionel Messi ever complete his career? By the time the World Cup arrived in Qatar, Lionel Messi had already won almost everything. Champions League titles, Ballon d'Or awards, league championships. But one trophy had always escaped him: the World Cup. For many fans, this was his final chance. Argentina battled their way through the tournament, and waiting for them in the final was France, led by Kylian Mbappé. The match that followed was pure madness. Argentina dominated early and built a 2-goal lead. Then, in just 97 seconds, Mbappé scored twice. Extra time followed. Messi scored. Mbappé answered again. The game finished 3-3. And for only the second time in history, the World Cup final would be decided by penalties. Argentina held their nerve. After decades of waiting, Lionel Messi finally lifted the trophy. Many fans, players, and experts immediately called it the greatest World Cup final of all time. What began in 1930 with just 13 teams has become the biggest sporting event on Earth. Billions of viewers, millions of visitors,
and memories that last forever. But the World Cup continues to evolve. In 2026, the tournament will be hosted by the United States, Canada, and Mexico. For the first time ever, 48 nations will participate, making it the largest World Cup in history. New countries will dream. New heroes will emerge. And somewhere, perhaps in a small town nobody has ever heard of, the next Pelé, the next Maradona, or the next Messi may already be kicking a football. For nearly a century, the FIFA World Cup has given us unforgettable moments, miracles, heartbreak, controversies, legends, and memories shared by billions of people around the globe. Empires have risen, generations have changed, and football itself has evolved. But one thing has remained constant. Every 4 years, the world stops. And for one magical month, humanity comes together through the beautiful game. Because the World Cup is more than just a tournament. It is history. It is emotion. And it is the greatest celebration of football the world has ever known. Thank you for watching this episode of Forgotten History. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the history of the FIFA World Cup, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And as always, we'll see you in the next episode.
Thanks for watching Forgotten History. Be sure to like and share this episode and hit that subscribe button. Stay tuned for the next episode.